Hook boring plus sleep-inducing in the quiet shadows of the Roman Empire, where marble streets echoed with the steps of senators and merchants, another kind of ceremony unfolded, not of war or politics, but of families, unions and promises. Unions and promises. Ancient Roman weddings wrapped in ritual, law and superstition were less about love and more about tradition. Tonight, let us slowly drift back into the silent corridors of Roman history. Chapter 1. The importance of marriage in ancient Rome. Marriage in ancient Rome was not merely a personal decision, nor a matter of romantic affection between two individuals. Instead, it was an institution woven tightly into the fabric of society, law, and family prestige. To understand why Roman weddings were conducted with such detail, one must first grasp what marriage represented in the Roman world. It was not the gentle union of two hearts, but rather the firm joining of two households, two names, and often two political ambitions. The Romans believed that marriage was essential for the stability of the state. A citizen without marriage and legitimate heirs was a citizen who contributed less to the perpetuation of Rome itself. Every Roman man, whether patrician senator or humble plebeian artisan, was expected at some point to marry and produce offspring. This expectation did not arise solely from the desire for companionship or the continuation of a family name. Instead, it emerged from a blend of legal duty, religious tradition, and the cultural obsession with legacy. In the early Republic, the Senate frequently emphasized the necessity of producing legitimate children to strengthen the Roman population. Without heirs, land and wealth might pass beyond the family, which could disrupt the balance of property ownership, a matter of deep concern in Roman politics. A man who remained unmarried was often looked upon with suspicion, as though he rejected the civic duty to ensure the survival of Rome's bloodlines. For women, the matter was even more binding, for their marriages determined not only their personal futures, but also the alliances between families. To the Romans, therefore, marriage was not an escape into private life. It was, paradoxically, a binding contract that pulled individuals deeper into the public sphere. A senator might secure influence by marrying his daughter into another powerful household. A wealthy merchant might acquire new trading opportunities by joining his family to another family of similar standing. Even ordinary plebeians often sought marriages that would raise their social respect within their neighbourhoods. The act of marriage was a declaration. Here, two names would be joined, and the strength of Rome would continue. It is easy from the modern perspective to imagine Roman couples exchanging vows beneath arches of flowers, smiling at one another with affection. But the Roman world was rarely so sentimental. Love could exist in marriages, of course, but it was not the foundation of them. More often, affection was expected to grow after the union was complete, if it grew at all. A Roman father arranging the marriage of his daughter did not ask whether she loved the man chosen for her. He asked whether the man's family had land, wealth, reputation, or political connections worth binding into his own lineage. Marriage was, above all, a transaction. This transactional nature did not diminish its importance. On the contrary, it heightened it. The greater the families, the greater the ceremony required to celebrate their joining. Weddings became spectacles of tradition, filled with symbols meant to please the gods, impress the neighbours, and reassure both households that the union was not only valid but auspicious. Every detail, from the way the bride was dressed to the words spoken by the witnesses, carried meaning. Nothing was left to chance, for chance could mean misfortune. And in a society where omens and divine favour were woven into every aspect of life, a marriage performed improperly risked not only embarrassment but the anger of the gods themselves. But there was more. To truly understand Roman weddings, one must consider how deeply marriage was tied to the Roman conception of family, or familia. Unlike modern notions of family, which often centre on emotional bonds, the Roman familia was a legal and religious unit extending far beyond the nuclear household. It included living members, ancestors remembered in rituals, and even slaves bound to the household. At the head of this structure stood the paterfamilias, the male head of the family, who wielded near absolute authority over all others. When a Roman woman married, she did not simply move into her husband's home. In some forms of marriage, she left behind the legal authority of her father and came under the control of her new husband's paterfamilias. This transfer of authority was not merely symbolic. It altered her inheritance rights, her religious duties, and even her position before the law. Through her, wealth and property could be moved between families. A miscalculated marriage could weaken a household, a shrewdly arranged one could make it prosper for generations. Thus, Roman weddings carried a weight far heavier than mere festivity. They were, in essence, the turning points of family destiny. The joy of music, the laughter of feasts, and the beauty of the bridal garments all concealed the iron framework of law and tradition beneath. To marry in Rome was to bind oneself into a structure greater than personal desire, and for the Roman people this structure was nothing less than the continuation of Rome itself. As night fell across the city and torches flickered against stone walls, neighbours would whisper about upcoming unions, speculating on what advantages might be gained or lost. Was the senator's daughter being offered to secure votes? Was the merchant's son marrying upward to polish the family name? Each wedding was more than a celebration. It was a shift in the invisible web of power that bound the Republic and later the Empire together. And so, when we drift into the details of Roman weddings, we must not picture them as quaint relics of antiquity. We must imagine them as Rome itself did, as vital ceremonies upon which the fortunes of households and even the stability of the empire might rest. In the hushed courtyards of Rome, where ivy curled against pale stone walls and the murmur of fountains never ceased, decisions about marriage were rarely made by the young men and women who were to wed. Instead, such decisions were shaped in the dimly lit chambers of family homes, where fathers sat in deep thought and mothers whispered behind veils, planning futures as carefully as a general planning a war. For to arrange a marriage in Rome was not unlike planning a campaign. Allies had to be secured, rivals had to be considered, and every move was made with the weight of generations pressing heavily upon the shoulders of the living. To marry was to bargain with destiny. The union of two households could shift fortunes, elevate one family above another, or seal old rivalries with fragile peace. Behind every Roman wedding lay the invisible hands of politics and family honour, weaving a net so tight that even love itself had little room to breathe. Imagine a senator, old and calculating, pacing the mosaic floors of his villa. His daughter, perhaps no more than 13, sat silently in the corner, her eyes lowered. She had no voice in the matter, for her life was not her own. The senator's mind was on the Senate floor, where debates raged about new laws and taxes. If he joined his household to that of another powerful senator, his votes could be secured. If, however, he sought a wealthy equestrian family, perhaps his coffers would swell with gold. To him, his daughter was not simply his child. She was the thread with which he might weave himself into the fabric of Rome's power. And yet, these choices were not limited to the nobility. Even among the common plebeians, marriage could determine survival. A baker might wish his son to marry the daughter of a grain merchant, ensuring a steady supply of flour for generations. A craftsman might hope to join his name to that of a family with a shop near the forum, ensuring better trade. In Rome, survival was never only about strength or skill. It was about connections, and marriage was the strongest connection of all. The negotiations were often long and deliberate. Families would send messengers, bearing cautious words and subtle inquiries. Was the dowry large enough? Did the family have enemies? Were there whispers of scandal, or rumours of disloyalty? In a city where gossip travelled faster than chariots, the reputation of a family could rise or collapse in a single season. Thus the discussions were careful, and often hidden behind layers of polite words that masked the raw ambition beneath them. At times, these negotiations could take strange and dramatic turns. There are tales whispered of fathers breaking alliances at the last moment, choosing instead to bind their daughters to unexpected households, leaving rivals humiliated and seething. A broken betrothal was not simply a personal insult. It could be a political declaration, a sign that trust had been betrayed. Bloodless wars were fought this way, across dining tables and under torchlight, as carefully as battles on the field. For Roman women, the stakes were heavy. A daughter's marriage might rescue a family's fortune, or it might doom her to a life of sorrow. Once she was married, her loyalty was no longer to her father's house but to her husband's family. She became a piece of living currency, carrying with her the dowry that her family offered to her. That dowry was not simply gold or land. It was often symbolic of the family's honour. A rich dowry meant generosity and power. A poor dowry could whisper of weakness. But for men too, the weight was immense. To choose wrongly was to bind oneself to weakness, or worse, to scandal. A man's career in the Senate, his rise in the military, even his place in society, all could be advanced or hindered by whom he married. Rome was a city that remembered. Every name carried echoes, and when two names joined, the echoes either harmonized or clashed. And so every Roman wedding carried with it the shadows of politics. Behind the laughter of feasts and the sweet music of pipes, there was the steady drumbeat of ambition. Guests might toast to love, but in their minds they measured influence. They calculated debts, favours and promises. The bride, glowing in her orange veil, might look serene, but she was at the centre of a delicate balance of power, one that could either strengthen her family or undo it. It is said that on the night before her wedding, a Roman bride would dedicate her childhood toys to the household gods, leaving behind her innocence as she prepared to enter the world of adulthood. But what she truly left behind was freedom. From that night onward, she would be less herself, and more the link between two families. Her smile, her presence, her children yet unborn, all would be counted as assets, as though she were a ledger written in flesh and blood. In this way, marriages in Rome were both beautiful and unsettling. They bound people together, yes, but often like knots tied too tightly, without regard for the comfort of those caught within them. And yet, in the eyes of Rome, they were necessary. Without them, households would crumble, lineages would end, and the great city itself would lose its strength. Thus, when we imagine Roman weddings, let us not see only the garlands of flowers and the clinking of goblets. Let us see the watchful eyes of fathers, the careful whispers of mothers, the trembling uncertainty of daughters, and the cold calculations of sons. For behind every union was the relentless march of politics and family honour, weaving destinies in patterns too vast for any one person to escape. Before the torches of the wedding were lit, before the music of flutes and lyres filled the air, there was the quieter, almost secretive stage of Roman union, the betrothal. Known as the sponsalia, it was less about celebration and more about negotiation, a contract of words and promises uttered beneath the watchful gaze of family and fate. It often began in silence. Imagine the villa of a Roman senator, its atrium cool with shadow, marble floors echoing faintly as sandals scraped across them. In one corner, the household gods gazed out from their niche, their clay eyes unblinking, as if they too listened to the murmurs of men. Fathers sat across from each other, not as friends, nor quite as enemies, but as players in a careful game. On the low table between them lay wax tablets, styluses ready to inscribe the future. The betrothal was not for the bride and groom. It was for the fathers, the guardians, the men who spoke not of love, but of property, alliances and dowries. The bride herself, perhaps no older than 12 or 13, stood silent in another room, her small hands twisting together as she tried to imagine a future she had no part in shaping. Somewhere beyond the walls, the sounds of Rome drifted in, the cries of merchants at the forum, the creak of carts along stone roads, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer. Yet here, within the villa, the sound was hushed, heavy, expectant. The betrothal was sealed with words. The father of the bride would declare spondesin, a due promise, and the groom, or often his father in his stead, would answer spondio, I promise. Spondio, I promise. These words carried a weight deeper than mere speech. They were binding as law, as binding as the unseen threads of fate that Romans believed guided every life. At times, the betrothal was marked by the exchange of gifts. The most enduring of these was the giving of a ring, often made of iron, plain and unadorned. To modern ears, an iron ring may sound harsh, cold, unromantic. Yet to the Romans, it symbolized permanence, strength, and the unbreakable bond of the contract. A golden ring, though rare, could appear among wealthier families, glittering as both ornament and omen of prosperity. The girl who received it might stare at it in silence, wondering what it meant to carry such a promise upon her small finger. But the betrothal was not always peaceful. There are tales, quiet whispered through time, of betrothals broken, promises revoked, dowries withdrawn. Such betrayals could ignite feuds that burned hotter than any wedding torch. A family slighted might carry the insult for decades, refusing alliances, nursing grudges that poisoned politics in the Senate and whispers in the forum. To break a betrothal was to declare war without a sword. Yet when the betrothal was honoured, it was followed by feasts, though modest compared to the wedding that would come later. Guests might gather in the triclinium, reclining on couches as slaves poured wine and carried platters of bread, olives, and roasted meats. The atmosphere, however, was not joyous in the way of love-struck celebrations. It was formal, heavy with expectation. Every eye watched the bride and groom, noting their posture, their silence, their expression. The union was not yet complete, but already the threads of two families had begun to weave together. And for the bride, this was the true beginning of her transformation. On the night of her betrothal, she often dedicated her childhood toys to the household gods, laying aside dolls, trinkets, and small tokens of youth. Each object placed before the shrine was a farewell to innocence. In their place, she would take up the veil of a bride, the flammeum bright as flame, and the weight of a destiny that was no longer her own. Imagine, for a moment, one such girl. She sits alone in her room, the oil lamp flickering against plaster walls. In her lap rests the iron ring, cool and heavy against her skin. She remembers her dolls, now lying at the feet of the gods, no longer hers. She knows the man she is promised to only by name, perhaps having seen him once from a distance. She wonders what his home looks like, what his voice sounds like, what life will be when she leaves her father's villa for his. Fear coils in her chest, but so too does a strange curiosity, a sense that she stands upon the edge of a world vast and uncharted. Outside, her father drinks wine with the groom's family. Speaking of land, influence, and dowries, he does not think of her fear, nor of her curiosity. He thinks only of his legacy. The betrothal is sealed, the contract spoken, the promise made. The girl is no longer merely his daughter. She is now a bridge, a living bond between households. Thus the Romans laid the foundation of marriage, not with laughter or affection, but with solemn promises, spoken in the stillness of halls where gods and ancestors listened. The wedding itself lay ahead, with its torches, feasts, and music. But already the girl's fate had shifted, her path redirected, her identity reshaped. She was betrothed, and in the eyes of Rome, that was the beginning of everything. The night before a Roman wedding was a night unlike any other. For the Romans believed that the hours before a marriage carried omens, and that the gods themselves leaned close to listen to the whispers of men. In the fading glow of the evening, the bride's household grew restless. Servants hurried through corridors preparing garments, polishing bronze lamps, arranging offerings to the household gods. The air smelled faintly of olive oil and burning incense, the familiar scent of devotion. In the centre of the house, before the lararium, the family shrine, small statues of the ancestors stood silent and watchful, waiting for the prayers of the living. The bride herself sat apart, surrounded by women, perhaps her mother, aunts or older cousins. Her childhood was ending tonight. According to tradition, she would gather her toys, small wooden dolls and trinkets she had once cherished, and place them reverently before the household gods. With trembling hands, she set them down one by one, as though giving away fragments of herself. This was no mere gesture, it was a farewell. The gods received her innocence, and in return, they would, it was hoped, bless her new life as a wife. Then came the loosening of her girdle, a symbolic act performed by her family, marking her passage from maidenhood to womanhood to womanhood. Her hair, too, would be prepared in the Sini crine style, divided into 6 braids, an ancient and sacred arrangement said to mirror the hairstyle of the Vestal Virgins, those priestesses who embodied purity. The act was slow, ceremonial, the braids twisting like strands of fate. But it was not only the bride who performed rituals that night. Her father, if still alive, made offerings at the household altar, beseeching the gods for favour. He might pray to Juno, goddess of marriage, or to Venus, goddess of love, asking that the union be fruitful and harmonious. Some families consulted augurs, men who read omens in the flight of birds or the entrails of sacrificed animals, to ensure that the marriage had divine approval. A single ill omen could send waves of dread through the household. Did a raven croak too loudly in the night? Did the flame of the lamp sputter and die too quickly? Such small signs could be interpreted as warnings, and the Romans, ever superstitious, did not dismiss them lightly. Imagine, for a moment, the hush of such a night. The villa lies still, its torches guttering low. Beyond its walls, the city of Rome murmurs faintly. The clatter of carts on the stones, the distant laughter from a tavern, the cries of a late-night vendor. But within, there is silence. The bride lies awake on her couch, staring into the shadows, the weight of tomorrow pressing upon her. She thinks of the husband she hardly knows. Will he be kind or cruel? Will she live as mistress of his house or as a silent figure in the background of his life? Her heart beats quickly, yet she cannot speak her fears aloud. For tomorrow there will be no turning back. In another chamber her mother whispers advice, some tender, some practical. Be obedient, she may say. Keep the household strong. Win the favour of your husband's family. And then, perhaps in softer tones, find what joy you can. Mothers knew the burden of Roman marriage. They had carried it themselves. Meanwhile, her father does not speak to her at all. His thoughts are elsewhere, on dowries, on alliances, on how tomorrow's union will secure his name in the delicate web of Roman politics. To him, this marriage is not merely his daughter's future. It is his legacy. Somewhere in the darkness, neighbours whisper. They wonder about the marriage, about what fortunes will rise or fall from it. They imagine the feast, the joining of hands, the procession that will carry the bride from her father's house to her husband's. Rome was always watching, and tomorrow it would watch again. As the night deepens, the bride finally drifts into uneasy sleep. Perhaps she dreams of torches flickering in the dark, of gods watching from the heavens, of the path ahead paved with both roses and thorns. Outside her chamber, the torches burn low, the household gods keep silent vigil, and the city waits for dawn. For tomorrow, the wedding would begin, a ceremony not merely of two individuals, but of two families, two names, and the eternal gaze of Rome itself. Dawn crept slowly across the tiled rooftops of Rome, the first pale light glinting off marble columns and bronze statues. In the bride's household, the night's silence broke into movement. Servants hurried through corridors, their sandals whispering against the stone floors, carrying vessels of water, armfuls of fabric, garlands of flowers. It was the morning of the wedding, and though the city stirred as usual, here, within the villa, the atmosphere was unlike any other day. The bride rose from her couch before the household altar, her eyes heavy from little sleep. The flicker of oil lamps still glowed faintly in the dawn, shadows dancing against the walls. Women of her family gathered around her, whispering softly, their hands busy with preparations. She was no longer a child, though only yesterday she had laid aside her toys. Today she would be dressed not as a daughter, but as a Roman bride, a figure who carried the weight of two families upon her shoulders. Her garments were simple, yet full of meaning. She wore the tunica recta, a plain white gown woven in the traditional upright loom, tied with a special knot around her waist, the nodus Herculaneus, or knot of Hercules. This knot was believed to symbolize fertility and strength, and only her husband would have the right to untie it later. The gown itself was unadorned, a reflection of purity, though its simplicity was deceiving. Every thread had been spun for this day, every fold a reminder of tradition reaching back to Rome's earliest ancestors. Over her head they placed the flammeum, the famous Roman bridal veil, or veil. Its bright orange-red colour glowed like fire in the dim light of the atrium. To the Romans, the veil's flame-like hue symbolised both fertility and the hearth fire, connecting the bride to Vesta, goddess of the home. Beneath it, her face seemed distant, half hidden, as though she were already stepping into another life, leaving behind the identity she had carried until now. Her hair was styled carefully into 6 braids, the Sini crines, divided and bound with ribbons of wool. This style, ancient and sacred, was said to be the same worn by the Vestal virgins, priestesses who embodied purity and devotion. Each braid twisted not just strands of hair, but strands of destiny, binding her to the long line of Roman brides who had walked this same path before her. The women who arranged her hair spoke in low voices, recalling their own weddings, murmuring blessings, warnings and hopes. Around her neck she wore a wreath of flowers freshly gathered. Orange blossoms, myrtle and other sacred plants were chosen for their associations with love, fertility and divine favour. The scent of them filled the air, mixing with the smell of oil lamps and incense. The fragrance was delicate, but to the bride it seemed overwhelming, as though every breath carried the weight of expectation. Her feet were bound in simple sandals, dyed a bright yellow, a striking colour that caught the eye as she walked. These shoes symbolised light and life, and some believed they echoed the flame of her veil, carrying forward the fire that would soon burn in her husband's hearth. When at last she was fully dressed, the women stepped back, gazing at her in silence. In that moment, she was both herself and not herself. She was a daughter transformed, a bride prepared, a living symbol of Rome's traditions. Her reflection in the polished bronze mirror seemed to stare back with unfamiliar eyes, as though the girl within had already begun to fade into the woman she was expected to become. Outside, the city awoke more fully. The cries of merchants grew louder. The rumble of carts echoed along the roads, and the distant voices of priests chanting morning prayers rose from temples scattered across the hills. Yet within the villa, time seemed slower, as though the weight of ritual had stilled the air. Every movement was deliberate, every gesture heavy with meaning. Before leaving, the bride would offer a final sacrifice to the household gods, her hands trembling as she placed small offerings of grain and wine upon the altar. She prayed silently, though perhaps she did not know what words to use. Should she ask for love, for children, for strength? Or should she simply ask for kindness from the man she was about to join? No one could say. The gods listened in silence, their clay figures staring as they had for centuries, unmoving, unchanging. And then, as the morning grew brighter, the preparations ended. The bride stood ready, her gown plain yet sacred, her veil glowing like fire, her hair braided in the style of the ancients. She was no longer only her father's daughter. She was now the living bond of two families, the centerpiece of a ceremony that was as much about Rome's future as it was about her own. The house grew still. Outside the door, the wedding procession would soon form: the groom, the witnesses, the guests, the torches. But within, for a brief moment, there was only silence. The bride's breath was steady, the air thick with incense and the soft rustle of fabric. The morning of her wedding had arrived, and nothing in her life would ever again be the same. While the bride's chamber filled with whispers, veils, and the scent of flowers, elsewhere in the city, another household stirred with equal weight. It was the home of the groom, where torches flickered against marble walls, and servants moved briskly to prepare the young man for the day that would bind his name to another family's legacy. For the groom's morning began not in the quiet privacy of his room, but in the public expectation of his household. For unlike the bride, who was transformed through garments and rituals, the groom was judged by his presence, his composure, and the dignity with which he stood before Rome. He was not expected to glow with beauty, but to radiate strength, seriousness, and the promise of authority. He dressed in the toga, the symbol of Roman citizenship. Unlike the simple white gown of the bride, his garment was heavy, its folds vast and carefully arranged. The toga was not an easy attire. It demanded practice to wear with grace. Slaves assisted him, lifting the wool, draping it across his shoulder, folding it in the manner expected of a man of standing. A poorly arranged toga was not just an embarrassment, it was an omen, a suggestion of disorder, a silent whisper that the gods themselves might frown upon the marriage. Beneath the toga, he wore the tunic, plain yet edged with the narrow or broad stripe that reflected his rank, senators with their broad purple bands, equestrians with their narrow ones. This tunic was not chosen for comfort, but for symbolism. It was a garment that declared his place in Rome, reminding all who saw him that he was not merely a man, but a citizen bound by duty. Before stepping into the public gaze, the groom, like the bride, offered sacrifices to the household gods. At the small shrine in his atrium, he poured wine and placed grain, murmuring prayers for the success of the union. Yet his prayers were different in tone. He did not ask for love, nor for kindness. He asked for strength, for fertility, for continuity of lineage. A Roman groom was expected to be the guardian of his family's name, and the gods he invoked were guardians of duty, not of romance. Still, even within the formality, the human heart stirred. Some grooms felt pride, some nervousness, others perhaps indifference. Imagine a young man, perhaps no older than 20, staring into a polished bronze mirror as servants adjusted the folds of his toga. His face is calm, but within his chest there is unease. He knows the girl only through whispers. Her name, her dowry, her father's reputation. He has never spoken to her at length. Tomorrow she will walk into his household, and with her will come not only her presence but her family's expectations, their watchful eyes. Around him, his male relatives gather. His father speaks of duty, his brothers jest lightly, though even their laughter is subdued by the weight of the day. Friends clapping on the shoulder, offering encouragement, though beneath their words lies the unspoken reminder, this is not about you. It is about Rome, about lineage, about family. Some grooms, especially among the nobility, performed more elaborate rites. They might consult augurs, seeking omens in the sky, ensuring the day was chosen under favourable signs. The calendar itself was consulted with care, for certain days were considered unlucky. Days sacred to the gods of the underworld, days marked by past defeats in Roman history. A marriage begun on such a day was said to invite disaster. To avoid misfortune, the wedding was often set on days sacred to Juno, the goddess of marriage, whose favour was considered essential for the union's success. As the groom stepped into the atrium, now fully prepared, the house hummed with restrained energy. Guests would soon arrive, witnesses who would stand beside him at the ceremony. These witnesses were not chosen at random. They were men of standing, whose presence lent weight and legitimacy to the marriage. Without witnesses, the marriage could not claim the dignity of law. Their role was silent but vital, their very attendance a seal upon the event. And so the groom waited, standing in his toga, the folds heavy upon his shoulder, the prayers lingering in the air. His face was calm, but his mind was restless. Beyond the walls of his villa, the bride was being veiled in flame-coloured cloth. Soon, the two of them would stand together, hands joined, words spoken, contract sealed. For now, he stood alone, a man on the edge of change, draped in wool and expectation, ready to step into the ceremony that would bind him not only to a woman, but to the endless, unyielding traditions of Rome. The streets of Rome did not echo with drums or wild celebration on the morning of a wedding. Instead, there was a hushed order to the day. Neighbours, relatives and invited guests gathered slowly, their sandals scraping over stone, their voices low, as though they too felt the weight of ancient tradition pressing upon them. The bride, veiled in her flame-coloured garment, stood surrounded by women of her family. The veil, flammeum, was not merely a covering, it was a curtain of transformation. Through its folds, her face was shadowed, her world dimmed. It symbolised fire, purity and the fragile spark of life that she would carry into her new home. The veil, bright and consuming, suggested that she belonged now not to her childhood, but to the sacred flame of her husband's hearth. The groom, draped in his toga, stood waiting. His companions, family members, friends and chosen witnesses, flanked him, their presence a silent testimony that this union was more than a private choice. It was a matter of lineage, legality, and the continuity of Rome itself. The ceremony took place either within the atrium of the bride's house or, in some cases, in the open courtyard beneath the protective gaze of the household gods. Small altars stood ready, bowls of grain, pieces of fruit, and vessels of wine glimmered in the light. Torches burned slowly, smoke curling upwards as though carrying whispered prayers to the heavens, and then came the central act. Before witnesses, the bride and groom extended their hands toward one another. This was no casual gesture. Far. It was called the dextrorum junctio, the joining of right hands. The priest, or sometimes the family patriarch, guided their hands together, palm to palm, a silent yet powerful declaration. In Rome, words were sacred, but gestures could be binding, and none more so than the solemn clasp of hands. The joining of hands was not merely symbolic. It was a declaration that the two would now face life side by side, their lives woven together like the threads of a garment. As their hands touched, the crowd murmured approval, and the gods were believed to bear witness. In this moment, the girl ceased to be Philia, the daughter under her father's power, and became Uxor, the wife under the mantle of her husband. Next came the spoken vow. In some forms of marriage, particularly the oldest and most sacred known as conferitio, words were recited before the presence of priests and 10 witnesses. A cake of spelt bread, coarse, simple and ancient, was shared between bride and groom, a symbolic meal that bound them together. As they tasted the bread, they tasted the weight of tradition, for this ritual was older than the Republic itself, a link to the earliest days of Rome. In other marriages, less formal yet still binding, contracts were read aloud, the dowry agreements confirmed, the legal documents sealed. The father of the bride might formally transfer authority, declaring that his daughter now passed from his guardianship into the guardianship of her husband. It was not romance, it was law, and yet, beneath the legal language, there was still humanity. Perhaps the bride's hand trembled beneath her veil. Perhaps the groom, though trained to stand in solemn dignity, felt his pulse quicken as her hand pressed into his. For all the formality, this was still the moment when 2 lives touched and would forever be altered. As the vows concluded, the guests offered shouts of blessing. Felicita, they cried, wishing happiness and fortune upon the union. Garlands of flowers were scattered, and small gifts were exchanged. Some threw nuts into the air, symbols of childhood cast away, for now the bride had entered womanhood. The gods of marriage were invoked one by one: Juno, protector of wives; Venus, patroness of love; and even Hymen, the divine spirit of weddings, whose name echoed in chants and blessings. Though Rome was stern, even Rome understood that divine favour was necessary for a union to endure. With the ceremony sealed, the couple stood side by side, still solemn, still bound by ritual. The air hung heavy with incense, the taste of spelt bread lingered on their lips, and the clasp of their hands burned like an unbreakable bond. It was done. The oath was sworn. The hands were joined. 2 lives were now one. Not by chance, not by passion, but by the decree of family, society, and the eternal traditions of Rome. When the vows had been spoken and the sacred hands joined, the Roman wedding turned toward its most awaited stage. For in Rome, no ceremony was whole until guests reclined at tables, food filled their plates, and wine loosened their tongues. The house, or sometimes a hired hall, became a theatre of abundance, its long wooden tables arranged, its couches lined with cushions, for the Romans did not sit but reclined when they dined. On their left arms they leaned, with their right hands they reached, and even this posture carried meaning, reminding all present that a wedding feast was no ordinary meal, but a ritual binding of families, neighbours, and the wider community. The first offerings were simple, for simplicity had its own dignity. Warm bread, its surface browned, its scent drifting like memory of fields and millstones, was carried forth. Bowls of olives followed, dark and glistening, little symbols of the land itself. Cheese, sharp and unevenly cut, appeared next, bearing the tang of cellars where it had aged. Yet restraint was never the Roman way, and soon abundance grew heavy. Whole birds roasted to perfection. Ducks, geese, even peacocks whose feathers had been carefully reattached for display, arrived upon silver trays. Fish salted and baked gleamed with oils, and over all was poured the sharp, unforgettable bite of garum, the Roman fish sauce that clung to the air with a pungency that guests accepted as a mark of tradition rather than taste. Wine came swiftly, borne in tall amphorae, sealed with pitch, mixed with water in great bowls, for unmixed wine was considered barbaric. Slaves moved like shadows, dipping ladles, refilling cups, weaving between the couches so that no guest's hand was left empty. Soon conversation swelled, laughter thickened, and the air grew warm with the mixture of smoke, food, and drink. Entertainment arrived as naturally as the courses. Soft notes rose from lyres and flutes, weaving melodies through the scent of roasting meat. Singers recited verses, their words floating between speeches and toasts. Dancers traced careful steps across mosaic floors, their gestures meant to amuse rather than astonish, for Roman weddings sought endurance more than spectacle. The bride herself, still veiled, entered the feast at last. Reclining now beside her husband, she accepted small tokens from the guests, nuts, garlands of herbs, coins pressed gently into her palm, each carrying whispered blessings of fertility, prosperity, and long life. The hours lengthened, as Roman feasts always did. Platters were carried out and cleared, dishes replaced, the clatter of crockery and the murmur of guests blending into one endless rhythm. Slaves hurried, their sandals whispering against the floor, while the masters leaned back upon cushions, chewing slowly, drinking steadily, speaking in tones that shifted from solemn to cheerful as the night wore on. It was not hunger alone that was being satisfied. It was the public display of abundance, the silent assurance that this marriage carried with it fortune's favour and the blessing of plenty. At last the final dishes came, honey cakes glistening with syrup, figs and dates stuffed with nuts, their sweetness clinging to the fingers. Guests ate them lazily, their voices now softened, their movements slower, their eyes heavy with wine. The musicians' notes faltered, the dancers' steps slowed, the torches burned low, and as the laughter fell into murmurs, and the clink of cups grew faint, the feast began to dissolve into silence. One by one, the guests departed, their sandals striking faint echoes in the night air. The house remained heavy with the scent of roasted meats and extinguished lamps. Yet for the bride and groom, the night was not yet over. Another ritual awaited them, a final passage into their new life together. The feast had bound the families, but the last rite would bind the two hearts, and in that stillness the Roman wedding would at last find its completion. The Romans lived in a world where nothing was simple and nothing was free of signs. A bird crossing the sky, a lamp sputtering in its oil, a word spoken at the wrong moment, all these could shift the course of a marriage, perhaps even of a lifetime. To them, omens were threads in the fabric of the universe, and no wedding was ever safe without them being carefully read and cautiously obeyed. Before the bride left her father's home, the household would pause, waiting, listening. Priests or wise elders watched the flight of birds, their wings tracing patterns against the morning sun. To see eagles soaring high was a blessing, a sign that Jupiter himself looked kindly upon the union. To hear a crow croak in the distance was less fortunate, for crows belonged to prophesy and often spoke of trouble. Even the sudden silence of dogs in the street, or the cry of an infant from another house, was considered a whisper from the gods, a clue that required interpretation. No less important were the little rituals of protection. Charms were tied around the bride's arms, small bits of wool twisted with red thread, meant to ward off the evil eye. Guests would call out jokes, sometimes crude, sometimes sharp, not merely to amuse but to distract lurking spirits that might envy the new couple. The very laughter was a shield, the very noise a wall. And when the bride stepped across the threshold of her new home, she was lifted by her husband not only as a gesture of strength, but also to avoid the ill fortune of stumbling. For to trip at that moment was to risk tripping forever in life. The gods themselves were ever present. Juno, the goddess of marriage, watched with her stern yet motherly gaze, and it was to her that prayers were whispered for fertility, loyalty, and harmony. Venus, the goddess of love, lingered too, though she was less predictable, her gifts carrying sweetness but also danger, for passion could burn as much as it warmed. Fortuna was invoked, the goddess of luck, for no marriage could stand on vows alone. Chance played its part, and fortune's wheel turned for every man and woman. At the feast, small offerings were made. A cup of wine poured upon the earth, a bit of bread set aside, a nut cracked and left untouched. These gestures, seemingly small, carried the weight of centuries. They reminded all that human love was never only human. It was a matter bound up in divine powers, in invisible eyes that saw what mortals could not. Even the night itself held omens. If the sky was clear and the stars bright, it meant the gods approved. If thunder rolled, it was taken as a warning. Some couples waited anxiously, hoping the heavens would remain silent. Others trusted the rituals, believing that their prayers and sacrifices had built a strong enough wall against misfortune. And so, every wedding in Rome was half celebration, half negotiation with the unseen world. The laughter, the music, the food, all these were not only for the guests, but also for the gods and the spirits. Every flame, every word, every gesture was heavy with meaning. The couple, though smiling, carried this invisible weight, knowing that their union was not theirs alone. It belonged to the family, to the city, to the gods above, and to the mysteries that whispered just beyond the light of the torches. The Romans believed that a wedding was not truly complete until the first night had passed, until the bride and groom were united not only before family and gods, but also in the private chamber, away from torches and feasting eyes. And yet, even this intimate moment was heavy with ritual, with meaning, with the weight of tradition that pressed upon them like the silent gaze of their ancestors. When the feast was over, when laughter had quieted and the last cups of wine had been drained, the bride was escorted to the threshold of her new home. She did not cross it by herself. She was carried. Strong arms lifted her gently, and she was borne across the wooden frame of the doorway. To stumble at the entrance was thought to be an omen of misery, a shadow that might haunt the years to come. By lifting her, the husband ensured that no ill luck could creep into their first step together. Once inside, the chamber glowed with soft lamplight, and offerings were waiting. A little fire burned at the hearth, a flame symbolizing Vesta, goddess of the sacred household fire. The bride touched it, sometimes with her own hand, sometimes with a piece of wool or bread, to show that she now belonged to this home, that she was ready to weave her life into its warmth. The bed itself was more than furniture. It was a stage where tradition and hope were acted out. Laurel leaves might be hung above it, a sign of protection and triumph. The coverlets might be dyed red or orange, colours of life and fertility. Nuts were scattered, sometimes crushed, sometimes rolled across the floor, symbols of childhood cast aside, symbols of new beginnings. For once married, the bride was no longer a girl. She was a woman, a matron, a bearer of the household's future. There was nervousness, of course. The silence between them was not only personal, but ceremonial. Words spoken too quickly, or laughter breaking at the wrong moment, could feel like a breach of the sacred. Yet there was tenderness as well, for even in Rome, beneath all the rules and omens, marriage was a human bond, and the wedding night was its most private promise. Beyond the chamber, the household might remain awake. Guests, drunk on wine, would sometimes sing songs outside the door, bawdy verses, half mocking, half protective. The noise was not only merriment, it was meant to guard the couple from envious spirits, to drown out the whispers of ill-wishing voices. In their laughter and crude poetry, there was a kind of shield, a barrier between the sacred bed and the dangerous night. For the Romans, the act of union was more than desire. It was cosmic. It mirrored the joining of earth and sky, the balance of order and chaos. To lie together was to create not only children, but continuity itself. Families endured through such nights. Cities endured, even empires endured, and so, though the moment belonged to two, its meaning belonged to all. At dawn, if the bride emerged smiling, if the husband greeted the household with pride, it was taken as a sign of blessing. The rituals had been successful, the omens favourable, the gods satisfied. Another Roman household had been formed, another knot tied in the endless tapestry of their civilization. And yet, beneath the ritual, beneath the prayers, beneath the wine and laughter, the wedding night was, as it has always been, a night of uncertainty and hope. A night when two strangers, or sometimes two lovers, stepped across the line of past and future, carrying with them all the weight of expectation and all the fragile beauty of new beginnings. In Rome, not every marriage was woven with the same silk. Some unions were dressed in gold and garlands, celebrated with banquets that stretched until dawn. Others were plain, little more than agreements whispered between households, sealed with bread and wine. And wine. The city was vast, and its people were divided. Patricians, plebeians, freedmen, slaves. Each class carried its own customs, its own weight of expectation, its own shadows. Among the patricians, the noble families who claimed descent from the founders of the Republic, marriage was more than love, more than companionship. It was politics. Alliances were built through the clasp of hands. Rivalries softened or sharpened through the giving of a daughter. A wedding could bind two houses together in loyalty, or it could quietly set the stage for betrayal. The bride was often young, sometimes scarcely a woman, but she carried on her shoulders the pride of her ancestors, the hope of her father, the ambitions of her kin. The ceremonies of the elite were rich with symbolism. The dowry was immense, measured in land, in silver, in slaves. Guests filled the atrium of the family estate. Priests spoke the old words, calling upon Juno, the guardian of marriage, and the witnesses drank deeply of wine poured into heavy cups. In these weddings, the bride wore the flame-coloured veil, the flammeum, her hair parted with a spear, a reminder of Rome's warlike origins. Even in the moment of union, the past whispered its presence. But among the plebeians, the common citizens, weddings were simpler. There was less gold, fewer witnesses, and yet no less meaning. Bread was broken, prayers offered, and neighbours gathered. Instead of grand banquets, there might be a modest feast with bread, olives, and wine diluted with water. These marriages carried the same rituals, but with fewer ornaments. The gods did not distinguish between golden chalices and clay cups, and so the blessings were believed to fall equally upon both. Freedmen, those who had once been slaves but had gained their freedom, occupied a strange middle space. Their unions were marked by hope, by the desire to prove themselves respectable, to rise, if not into nobility, then at least into dignity. A freedman's wedding might blend the old and the new, Roman rituals mixed with the customs of lands from which they or their ancestors had been taken. For them, marriage was more than alliance. It was a declaration, we are free, we are Roman, we belong. And then there were the slaves. For them, marriage as the law defined it did not exist. A slave could not make a legal union, could not pass on his name to children, could not claim a wife before the magistrates. Yet among themselves, in the hidden spaces of the household, in the shadow of the master's villa, they formed bonds, her bonds. They called them contubernium, a sharing of life under the same roof. It was not recognised by law, but it was recognised by the heart. They whispered vows, they shared bread, they cradled children together. Though fragile, though always at risk of being broken by a sale, a punishment or a whim, these unions were real. They were as tender, as human as any gilded patrician wedding. The Romans themselves were aware of these differences. A noble might scorn the simplicity of a plebeian feast. A citizen might ignore the quiet devotion of slaves, but time has a way of softening distinction. The gods, perhaps, smiled upon all unions alike, for all were bound by the same hopes, to build a household, to see children grow, to leave something of themselves behind. And so Roman marriage was not one thing but many. It was luxury and poverty, ceremony and simplicity, law and longing. In the marble halls of the patricians and the cramped rooms of the poor, the wedding night carried the same whisper of uncertainty, the same fragile dream of tomorrow. For whether clothed in silk or homespun wool, whether praised by priests or ignored by law, the act of joining two lives was always sacred, always human. For all their ceremonies, their feasts, their sacred prayers to the gods, not every Roman marriage endured. The Romans, practical in law and often cold in sentiment, treated divorce not as tragedy, but as possibility, as natural as a contract being broken. Where love and duty failed, papers and witnesses stepped in. What had been bound by clasped hands could be unbound by a simple parting of words. In the early days of the Republic, divorce was rare, almost unthinkable. Marriage was sacred, bound by tradition and the gods. But as Rome grew, as wealth poured into the city, as ambition sharpened and politics turned families into weapons, divorce became easier and common. By the time of the late Republic, stories of husbands and wives separating were whispered in every forum, every market, every bathhouse. For the patricians, divorce was often a weapon of politics. A senator might set aside his wife not because of quarrels or disappointment, but because another marriage promised more power, more influence, more gold. Daughters were pawns in these games, married, divorced, remarried, all to strengthen alliances. A woman could be noble in the morning, discarded by evening, and promised to another before dawn. Rome was not gentle in matters of family. Yet the law gave women too a strange kind of power. Unlike in many ancient societies, a Roman wife could initiate divorce. All she needed to say was the old words, tuas resi tibi habito, keep your own things to yourself. With that, the union dissolved. Property was divided, dowries returned, and lives began again. This freedom shocked outsiders, but to the Romans it was simply order, a way to reset when harmony could not be kept. Among the plebeians, divorce was quieter, less political, but still real. A baker might leave his wife because of poverty, a craftsman might be abandoned for drink, a woman might walk away from a husband who failed to provide. The law allowed it, society accepted it, and so lives broke apart as easily among the poor as among the rich. But though divorce was easy, it was never without pain. Children were caught between parents, households divided, friendships strained. A woman returning to her father's home might carry shame with her, even if she was not at fault. A man left without a wife might be seen as weakened, unfit to manage his household. Rome was practical, yes, but beneath the laws and customs lay the same ache that every broken marriage leaves behind. The philosophers argued about it. Some claimed divorce was proof of Rome's decay, of luxury eating away at duty. Others defended it as freedom, a safeguard against misery. The truth, as always, lay somewhere between, in the quiet sadness of a woman packing her things, in the silent anger of a man watching her leave, in the hollow space at a table once meant for two. For the slaves and the freedmen, divorce was less a matter of law and more a matter of survival. Among slaves, bonds could be broken not by choice but by command. A master could sell a husband away, could separate a wife from her children, could tear apart what little love had been built in the shadows. For freedmen, the law allowed separation, but poverty often bound couples together even when love had withered. To live apart was costly. To remain together was sometimes the only choice. So in Rome, marriages ended as often as they began. The city that built empires also unravelled households. But still, people married again. The hope of love, or at least of stability, never died. Just as the Tiber flowed steadily through the city, so too did the cycle of union and separation, of vows and farewells. Divorce was not the end, but only another turn in the long, restless story of Roman life. The Romans lived in a world filled with signs. To them, nothing was random. A bird's cry, a flicker of flame, the way a shadow fell across the ground, all carried meaning. And in the delicate moment of marriage, when two households were being bound together, omens and superstitions mattered more than anything. A wedding without proper signs was thought doomed before it even began. Before the ceremony, augurs, priests trained to read the will of the gods, were often consulted. They looked to the skies, studying the flight of birds. If the birds flew straight and free, it was a blessing. If they circled oddly or disappeared, it was a warning. Sometimes even the smallest rustle of wings was enough to delay a wedding, for who would dare bind two lives together if the heavens themselves frowned? Thunder was feared above all. If thunder rolled during the wedding rites, the marriage was halted. Boom! It was Jupiter's voice, the great god of sky and law. declaring his displeasure. Couples would wait days, even weeks, for a clearer sign, terrified to anger the divine powers that ruled their fates. Even within the ceremony itself, superstition guided every step. The bride, veiled in her flame-coloured veil, was careful not to trip as she entered her husband's house. A stumble was a dark omen, a sign that misfortune would follow her. To avoid this, some grooms carried their brides over the threshold, not out of romance but out of fear, ensuring that her feet would not catch on the doorway and invite disaster. The choice of day itself was weighed with superstition. Certain months, like May, were avoided entirely, for they were tied to festivals of the dead. To wed in May was to call shadows into the home. The kalends, nuns and ides, the 1st, 5th and 13th days of the month, were likewise shunned, believed unlucky for unions. Instead, carefully chosen days in June, blessed by Juno, goddess of marriage, were thought to carry the best fortune. Even the cries of animals could sway a family's decision. A dog howling in the night before a wedding was dreaded, a whisper that death might touch the household. A crow overhead was ominous, but a dove, soft and gentle, was considered a gift of Venus herself, the goddess of love. The Romans believed objects, too, carried meaning. The knot in the bride's belt, tied carefully before the ceremony, was more than cloth. It was a charm of fertility, a protection against envy and harm. Only the husband was allowed to untie it, and even then carefully, for to break it with haste was thought to invite quarrels into the marriage. Guests themselves added to the superstitions. As they shouted and sang, they also called out "Atalasio," a word whose origins were half forgotten, but whose sound was thought to drive away evil spirits. Laughter and noise, far from being simple joy, were weapons against darkness, meant to shield the couple in their most vulnerable hour. And when the wedding feast ended, the bride and groom were watched closely. A candle that went out suddenly, a cup that spilled, even the flicker of shadows across the floor, all could be read as warnings. To live in Rome was to live in constant conversation with the unseen, with gods, spirits and signs. To us, these omens may seem strange, fragile beliefs lost in time. But for the Romans, they were as real as stone. To marry without them was unthinkable. To ignore them was to risk not just one's own happiness, but the wrath of the gods themselves. And so, every wedding in Rome was more than a ceremony. It was a negotiation with fate, a delicate dance between human hope and divine will. In Rome, marriage was not always a quiet matter of family and private vows. Sometimes it was a public spectacle tied to festivals, processions, and the rhythm of the city itself. The Romans loved ceremony, and when the bond of marriage could be woven into the larger fabric of society, it became more than a personal union. It became an event for the gods, for neighbours, and for the state. Festivals often created the perfect backdrop for weddings. The festival of Juno, held in June, was especially favoured. Juno was not just the protector of women, but also the guardian of marriage. To marry beneath her gaze was considered the greatest blessing. Families arranged unions around her sacred days, believing her favour would bring harmony and many children. And this is why even centuries later, June weddings still echo with ancient Roman custom. Public weddings could also be tied to politics. Senators and generals often staged elaborate marriages, not only to honour the gods, but also to display their wealth and power. The entire city might witness the procession. The bride in her flame-coloured veil carried in a chariot, escorted by musicians, dancers and slaves bearing torches. Streets filled with cheers, the air heavy with incense. What should have been a private bond between two people became a stage where Rome itself was the audience. Certain festivals were avoided, however. The Parentalia, a solemn festival for the dead, was thought unfit for joy. To wed in such days would invite restless spirits to the feast, to the festival of Vinalia, dedicated to wine, or the Saturnalia in December, with its feasts and gift-giving, often saw marriages celebrated in a lighter spirit. Saturnalia especially, when roles of master and slave were briefly overturned, blurred the lines of custom. Some records even whisper of weddings across classes during this time, when normal rules softened, if only for a few days. At public weddings, the feasting stretched further, sometimes spilling into the forum or marketplace. Musicians played flutes, actors performed short scenes, and children sang songs, both of blessing and mockery. For Romans believed laughter protected against envy, and even a joke at the bridegroom's expense could serve as a shield against ill luck. The union of bride and groom was also tied to Rome's destiny. Marriages among the elite symbolized alliances between families, and in a city where lineage meant power, these ceremonies became instruments of politics. The crowd did not simply watch, they witnessed the merging of names, estates, and futures. The festival air masked the weight of ambition, but everyone knew a wedding could be as much about Rome as it was about love. And so, beneath banners and torches, with the echo of chants and the smell of roasted meat drifting through the streets, Roman weddings during festivals became something larger than life. They were not just moments of union, but spectacles of belief, wealth, and destiny, woven into the heartbeat of the eternal city. In Rome, marriage was never only about love. It was also about property, alliances, and wealth. Behind the veil of the bride and the laughter of the guests, numbers were being calculated, estates were being discussed, and the weight of gold was often heavier than the weight of affection. The dowry, dos in Latin, stood at the very centre of this arrangement. A dowry was the property a bride brought with her into the marriage, provided by her father or guardian. It could be land, coin, slaves, or even livestock. To the Romans, a marriage without a dowry was considered incomplete, a sign of poverty or misfortune. Families measured their honour by what they could send with their daughters. For wealthy households, the dowry could be immense. Senators gave estates, villas by the sea, or priceless works of art. In such unions, the marriage tied not just two people, but two fortunes. The bride herself became a bridge, the living symbol of wealth passing from one house into another. Yet, once given, the dowry was controlled by the husband. He managed it, invested it, and used it as part of his estate. The woman, though the source of the fortune, often had no say in its use. But Roman law, always practical, allowed for protection. If a husband divorced his wife without cause, the dowry could be reclaimed. This ensured that families did not lose their wealth unjustly, and it kept some balance in a system where women otherwise had little legal power. In this way, money became both a bond and a weapon, holding marriages together as much as affection did. Beyond dowries, gifts filled the Roman wedding. Guests brought presents, simple items like lamps, vases, and small statues, or more extravagant tokens depending on their wealth. These were not mere ornaments, but carried symbolic meaning. A lamp promised light in the new household. A spindle or loom represented industry and the duties of the Weifrau. Let's get different. Even food, such as figs or honey, was offered to bring sweetness to the marriage. The groom, too, gave gifts, sometimes jewellery, sometimes clothing, and in elite households, even estates were presented. These gestures displayed not just generosity, but status. A wealthy groom who gave lavish gifts proved to all present that he was capable of maintaining not only a wife, but an entire household. For the poorer classes, gifts were humbler: a clay oil lamp, a simple jug, a loaf of bread. Yet even here, the symbolism mattered. See, the poorest Roman could still offer meaning, even if he could not offer gold. In the eyes of the gods, intent mattered as much as value. Thus, Roman weddings, beneath the laughter and ritual, were deeply economic. Every feast, every torch, every song was tied to wealth. Marriage was not just a joining of hearts, but a careful weaving of fortunes, debts, and promises. To the Romans, this was not cynical, it was survival. A union without wealth was fragile. A union with wealth was enduring. And so, behind every flame-coloured veil, there was always the shimmer of gold. Not every Roman wedding was forgotten in the dust of time. Some were remembered, whispered, and written down because they tied into Rome's great politics, scandals, and legends. These marriages were not just personal events, but milestones in history, shaping dynasties and the fate of the empire. One of the most famous weddings was that of Julius Caesar's daughter, Julia, to Pompey the Great. Their marriage in 59 BCE was more than a union of man and woman. It was a political pact. Julia was young, admired for her beauty and grace, while Pompey was one of Rome's most powerful generals. Their bond softened tensions between Caesar and Pompey, but only for a time. When Julia died in childbirth, their fragile alliance crumbled, and soon after, Rome was plunged into civil war. Here, a wedding that once promised peace became a memory of what might have been. Another wedding, though far darker, was that of the notorious Emperor Nero. In 62 C, Nero married Poppaea Sabina after forcing his first wife to divorce, and later, according to ancient sources, ordering her death. Poppaea herself was a woman of ambition, and their wedding was lavish, filled with gold, music, and public spectacle. yet behind the glitter lay cruelty and instability. Their marriage became a symbol of Nero's decadence, remembered less for love and more for scandal. Then there was the legendary union of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt. Though not a Roman wedding in the traditional sense, their bond carried immense weight for Rome. Their ceremony in Alexandria blurred Roman customs with Egyptian splendor. For the Romans it was shocking, Antony, once a loyal general, binding himself to a foreign queen. Octavian, later Augustus, used this union as proof of Antony's betrayal. And so their wedding, wrapped in passion and power, became the spark of Rome's final civil war. In contrast, Augustus himself, the first emperor, used his marriages carefully. His union with Livia Drusilla was remembered as one of Rome's most stable imperial marriages. Though it began controversially, she was already pregnant by her previous husband when Augustus married her. Their partnership endured for decades. Livia became a symbol of Roman matronly virtue, her presence shaping the image of the imperial household for generations. Some weddings were famous for extravagance. Caligula, the unpredictable emperor, was said to have staged multiple marriages with shocking speed, marrying and divorcing women within days. His weddings, less about ritual, were displays of his erratic power, remembered by historians as both absurd and terrifying. And not all famous weddings belong to emperors or generals. Some stories survive because of drama. Inscriptions tell of unions between gladiators and noblewomen, whispered scandals that shook Roman gossip. A bride who abandoned her family for the arena, or a senator's daughter caught in a forbidden love. Such tales were exaggerated, but they reveal how deeply Rome tied fascination with marriage to its collective imagination. These famous weddings remind us, in Rome, a marriage was never private. Whether for peace, scandal, or ambition, weddings could alter the course of history. Love may have played a part, but politics, power, and destiny always stood close by, watching from the shadows. After the sacred rituals and the binding vows, Roman weddings shifted into a different atmosphere, one of noise, laughter, and celebration. If the ceremony bound two families, the feast and music gave life to that union, carrying it into the hearts of the guests. In the streets of Rome, and in the villas of the wealthy, music and dance were as essential to a wedding as the vows themselves. Musicians filled the gatherings with sound. The soft hum of the tibia, a double pipe flute, drifted through the air, while the deeper rhythm of drums carried the beat. Cymbals clashed, harps were plucked, and singers wove verses of praise for the couple. Some songs were light and playful, teasing the bride and groom. Others were solemn, invoking the gods to bless the union with children, prosperity, and peace. The Romans believed music was more than entertainment. It was a bridge between mortals and the divine. Dancing soon followed. For the upper classes, dances were often formal, graceful movements performed by hired entertainers. In the poorer quarters, however, weddings became wild celebrations, with guests themselves dancing in circles, clapping hands, and stamping their feet in rhythm. The bride, veiled in her saffron-coloured flammeum, sometimes joined the dance, her steps slow at first, then freer as the feast carried on. And there was always noise, joyful, unrestrained noise. Guests shouted blessings, jokes, and bawdy verses. The wedding procession through the streets rang with cheers, songs, and sometimes even mockery, for Romans believed laughter could ward off evil spirits. Torches blazed, drums pounded, and the night air echoed with chants as the bride was led to her husband's home. The feasting was no less important. Platters of roasted meats, fresh bread, olives, and honeyed cakes were passed around. Wine flowed in endless streams, loosening tongues and lifting spirits. For the wealthy, the display of food was a symbol of power, exotic fruits from far provinces, fine spices, and rare fish. For the poor, it was simpler, but no less joyful: bread, cheese, figs, and the comfort of shared company. These celebrations often lasted deep into the night. In rural villages, neighbours gathered with torches, singing rustic songs as they accompanied the couple home. In the city, parties spilled into courtyards and streets, with music echoing between the stone walls of insulae and mansions alike. To outsiders, Roman weddings may have looked chaotic, a blend of sacred and silly, reverent prayers followed by drunken laughter. Yet to the Romans, this balance was essential. The gods required respect, but the couple needed joy. A marriage begun with silence and sorrow was considered unlucky. A marriage begun with noise, music, and laughter carried strength into the future. Thus, Roman weddings lived not only in memory for their rituals but for their celebrations. The sounds of flutes and drums, the sight of torches and dancing, and the taste of bread and wine. Long after the vows were spoken, it was the music and the laughter that echoed in the minds of those who had been there. In Rome, no wedding was complete without the presence of the divine. To the Romans, marriage was not simply an agreement between two families. It was a sacred bond, overseen by the gods and sealed through ritual. Religion shaped every step of the ceremony, from the bride's first prayer to the moment she crossed her husband's threshold. Without the blessing of the gods, a marriage was thought to be fragile, cursed, or even invalid. Priests, therefore, played a crucial role. At the heart of Roman religion stood the Pontifex Maximus and the Flemines, but in weddings, the most important figure was often the Pontifex or a local priest trusted by both families. He guided the rituals, ensured the omens were favourable, and invoked the gods' presence over the union. His voice, chanting prayers, was meant to link the mortal ceremony to the divine order. One of the most sacred rites was the offering to Jupiter, the king of the gods. A lamb or small animal was sacrificed, its smoke rising as a signal to the heavens. The priest would sprinkle grain, salt, and wine upon the altar, while the families stood in silence, awaiting the sign of acceptance. If the omens were good, the marriage could proceed with confidence. But if the entrails of the sacrifice showed ill fortune, the families might hesitate, for the god's displeasure was never taken lightly. Their bride, too, was placed under divine protection. She often dedicated her childhood toys or garments to the goddess Venus, marking her passage into womanhood. During the ceremony, she prayed to Juno, the goddess of marriage and childbirth, asking for harmony, loyalty, and future children. Priests would invoke Juno's blessing, for without her favour, no union was thought to thrive. Even the smallest details were guided by religion. The joining of hands, dextrum iunctio, was not just symbolic, it was sanctified by the priest, who declared it binding under the gods. The wedding fire, lit upon the hearth, was dedicated to Vesta, guardian of home and family. Every spark was a promise of warmth and continuity. Religion also dictated what was forbidden. Certain days were considered unlucky for marriage. During the Parentalia festival of the dead, for example, no weddings could take place as the boundary between the living and the dead was too thin. Priests were keepers of this sacred calendar, ensuring that no couple tempted fate by choosing the wrong day. And yet, not all weddings required priests in equal measure. Among the lower classes, private ceremonies with simple prayers were common. Among the elites, however, priests ensured the grandeur and legitimacy of unions that shaped Roman politics. When a senator's daughter married a general, or when an emperor chose his bride, priests stood at the centre, their authority binding not just families but the destiny of Rome itself. Thus, religion was never far from the Roman wedding. Every torch, every chant, every offering carried meaning beyond the visible. Behind the laughter of guests and the music of flutes, there lingered always the quiet presence of the gods, watching, judging, and if pleased, blessing the couple's future. In the heart of Roman society, it was women who carried the weight of tradition. While priests, politicians, and family patriarchs often claimed authority, it was mothers, sisters, and female relatives who ensured that the ancient rituals of marriage were never forgotten. Without them, the customs that gave Roman weddings their meaning would have faded into silence. From the earliest preparations, women guided the bride. Mothers often spent weeks teaching their daughters the steps of the ceremony. How to wear the saffron veil, how to recite the prayers, and how to behave with modesty during the rituals. Older women reminded the bride that she was leaving her father's household forever, stepping into a new life. Their voices were both tender and firm, binding her to centuries of tradition. On the day of the wedding, female relatives oversaw the dressing of the bride. They braided her hair into 6 sacred plaits, a style known as the sine crines, symbolizing purity and continuity. It was women's hands that tied the woolen belt, the cingulum around her waist, a knot the groom would later untie. These tasks were not mere decoration, they were acts of devotion, performed with care so that no mistake could anger the gods. Even during the noisy celebrations, women were guardians of meaning. While men feasted and laughed, older women whispered reminders of proper conduct, ensuring that rituals were respected. They prepared offerings, lit the sacred torches, and sang ancient songs that connected the wedding to Rome's earliest days. These songs, carried on from mother to daughter, held more power than written laws, for they kept alive the invisible thread of memory. It was also women who preserved the superstitions. They warned against omens, reminded families which days were unlucky, and carried charms to protect the bride. A mother slipping a protective amulet into her daughter's hand might never appear in official records, but such gestures carried the weight of centuries. In the home, too, women shaped the meaning of marriage. Once the bride entered her husband's household, it was the mother-in-law who received her, guiding her into her new duties. She instructed her in the rituals of the hearth, teaching her to honour Vesta, the goddess of the household fire. In this way, the cycle continued. The traditions of Roman marriage passed from one generation of women to the next. Though men held the legal authority, it was women who carried the living memory of Rome's wedding customs. They were the quiet keepers of ritual, the singers of old songs, the guardians of sacred gestures, and through their hands, Roman weddings remained not just ceremonies of law, but sacred bridges between past and future. Though centuries have passed since the fall of Rome, the echoes of Roman weddings still linger in traditions around the world. The empire may have crumbled, but its customs, shaped by ritual, symbolism, and faith, found new homes in the cultures that followed. To understand modern weddings, one must often look back to Rome. One of the most enduring influences is the wearing of the bridal veil. In ancient Rome, the bride's saffron-coloured flammeum covered her head like a sacred flame, a sign of modesty and protection. Though its colour has changed to white in modern times, the veil remains a powerful symbol of purity and transition, a direct inheritance from Roman brides who walked beneath the watchful eyes of their families and gods. The exchange of rings also has Roman roots. Romans believed that a vein in the fourth finger of the left hand, the vena amoris, the vein of love, led directly to the heart. Thus, when a groom placed a ring upon his bride's finger, it was seen as binding not just her hand, but her heart, a heart, a heart. This gesture has survived the centuries, passed into Christian and later European traditions. Until today, it remains one of the most universal symbols of marriage. Even the idea of processions, the journey of the bride from her father's home to her husband's, left its mark. In Rome, this was a moment filled with torches, songs, and blessings. In later cultures, it transformed into the wedding march, the ceremonial walk down the aisle, or festive parades that still echo the Roman belief that marriage was not only a private union, but a public celebration. Dowries, too, trace their roots to Rome. The practice of transferring wealth, land, or property as part of marriage arrangements became a cornerstone of medieval Europe, adapted but never abandoned. In some places, it still shapes family negotiations, a shadow of the Roman system that once tied wealth to union. Religion also carried Rome's influence forward. The blessings of priests in Roman ceremonies laid the foundation for Christian wedding rites. When the Roman Empire embraced Christianity, many ancient customs were not discarded but reshaped: the joining of hands, the priestly prayers, even the use of sacred fire. What began as offerings to Juno and Vesta slowly transformed into prayers before Christian altars, yet the essence remained the same: divine approval for a human bond. Even superstitions survived. Romans avoided unlucky days and watched for omens. Later cultures, too, would caution against weddings in certain months, fear the breaking of mirrors, or cling to charms for good fortune. These whispers of the past are still alive in phrases like a something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue. The influence of Roman weddings was not limited to Europe. Through conquest and trade, their customs spread to North Africa, the Middle East, and beyond. Wherever Rome's legions marched, they carried with them not only weapons and laws, but rituals of life, and among these, the rites of marriage proved the most enduring. In truth, when a modern couple exchanges rings, walks down the aisle, or wears a bridal veil, they unknowingly step into the footsteps of Romans. The empire has long vanished, but in the gentle glow of wedding ceremonies, the spirit of Rome still flickers, quietly binding the past to the present. As our journey through the world of ancient Roman weddings comes to an end, we are left with more than just rituals and customs. We are left with a portrait of a civilization that understood the power of union. To the Romans, marriage was never a simple contract. It was a sacred passage, a binding of families, a promise to gods, and a thread that tied generations together. Across the chapters, we have walked through narrow Roman streets, lit by torches, stood in homes where mothers whispered blessings, and listened to priests invoking the favour of Juno. We have watched brides step forward in saffron veils, grooms extend their right hands in solemn vows, and crowds erupt in feasts and laughter. Every detail, the ring, the knot of wool, the songs sung by women, carried meaning deeper than words. And though centuries have passed, those echoes still reach us. The traditions of Rome shaped cultures far beyond its empire, leaving imprints that live on in today's weddings. The white veil, the wedding procession, the sacred exchange of rings, all these are quiet reminders that Rome's memory has never truly faded. Even in the most modern ceremonies, the spirit of Roman weddings breathes, unseen but enduring. But perhaps the greatest legacy of Roman marriage lies not in rituals or symbols, but in its eternal belief in union. To the Romans, love was fleeting, but marriage was enduring. It was the foundation of family, the pillar of society, the bridge between past and future. Every wedding, no matter how small, was a declaration that life continued, that traditions would live on, and that humanity's greatest strength was not in war or conquest, but in the bond of two lives joined together. So, as we close this story, imagine the distant music of Roman flutes, the glow of torchlight on cobbled streets, and the voices of brides and grooms long gone, whispering vows into the night. Their world may have turned to dust, but their weddings, their symbols of love, unity, and continuity, remain eternal. This is the true gift of Rome, that even in silence, even in sleep, its traditions still bind us all. The story of Roman weddings may now rest, but their spirit continues to linger, like faint torchlight at the edge of memory. What began as rituals beneath the gaze of ancient gods has become the quiet heartbeat of modern traditions. Every veil, every ring, every procession is a whisper from centuries long past, carried forward like a secret blessing. As you reflect on this journey, imagine the streets of Rome now empty and silent, yet still alive in the echoes of laughter, music, and vows once spoken. The people are gone, the empire has fallen, but the love they celebrated, the promise they believed in, remains untouched by time. Roman weddings were never just about two people. They were about the weight of family, the trust of community, and the approval of the divine. They were about unity, endurance, and the fragile hope that life continues beyond all endings. And in that hope, Rome discovered something eternal. So as this tale fades into silence, remember, traditions may change, empires may fall, but the essence of love and union is immortal. Just as Rome's brides once walked into torchlit nights, so too do we walk into the future, carrying with us the same unbroken thread of promise. The empire has turned to history. The weddings have turned to legend. But the bond, the eternal bond, lives on, lives on.